There are new bombshell claims today from royal insiders who say King Charles's cancer is incurable and he will likely die with the disease.
Prince William entered the private consultation believing he was about to receive another careful medical update. Instead, the doctors closed the door, removed every unnecessary document from the table, and delivered the sentence he had feared but had never prepared himself to hear. King Charles's condition had entered a critical phase. His treatment was no longer stabilising him. His public duties had to stop immediately, and William would be required to assume responsibilities far sooner than anyone had expected. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. William gripped the table until his knuckles whitened. He asked the senior physician to repeat the conclusion, though every word had already struck with brutal clarity. Charles had deteriorated after weeks of demanding engagements, and the treatment controlling his illness was no longer producing the response the doctors needed. Those duties included state briefings, national ceremonies, and constitutional meetings that could not remain unattended. William wanted to enter Charles's room and stay there, yet the crown was pulling him away, placing responsibility into his hands before grief allowed him to breathe. One doctor hesitated before revealing the detail that changed everything. Charles had known for days that his results were deeply concerning, but he had ordered the information withheld until a second assessment confirmed the danger. The disclosure came through documented consultation notes, leaving no room for doubt. William closed his eyes. His father had faced the fear alone, and the silence felt like a final wall between them. He could not tell which emotion had arrived first. Then the physician placed a sealed medical briefing before him. A medical briefing was a confidential summary of the king's condition and the decisions required if illness stopped him from carrying out his role. Across the envelope, Charles had written instructions concerning the crown, Camilla, and the duties William would assume if the monarch became unable to continue. William lowered himself into the chair and stared at the handwriting. He removed his wedding ring, pressed both hands over his face, and remained silent. When he looked up, disbelief had hardened into controlled fear. Before he could break the seal, footsteps approached outside. When Camilla entered and saw the sealed envelope in William's hands, her grief was immediately joined by another emotion: fear over what Charles had written before his condition worsened. The medical verdict did not strike one family in the same way. William heard the possible end of a father's reign. Camilla heard the possible loss of the man around whom she had rebuilt her entire life. Catherine understood that her husband might soon carry the crown while still trying to hold himself together, and behind the hospital doors, Charles remained silent, knowing that every person he loved was already being forced into a future none of them wanted. Camilla looked first at William, then at the sealed envelope still partly hidden beneath his hand. She asked exactly what the doctors had said. The prince answered carefully, explaining that Charles's treatment had stopped controlling the illness and that every public duty had been suspended. Yet he did not mention the handwritten instructions. He slipped them inside his coat after noticing how often her eyes returned to the envelope instead of the medical reports. William had prepared for the crown throughout his adult life, but that preparation had always belonged to some distant day. Now, the constitutional expectation, the formal duty requiring the heir to step forward when the monarch cannot serve, had become a personal crisis. He wanted to remain beside his father. Instead, officials were already waiting for decisions that only he might soon be able to make. Camilla felt the change before anyone stated it aloud. Her place within the monarchy rested on her marriage to Charles as much as on her title. Without him carrying out his duties, the Queen Consort risked losing both emotional security and practical influence. She pressed William again, asking whether there was anything else. His pause gave her the answer. He refused to speak. Catherine received his call moments later. William tried to sound controlled, but his voice broke as he said, "It is worse than we thought." She sat down without speaking. The princess understood that her husband was not only facing the possible loss of his father, but he was also being pulled toward kingship while still struggling to accept what the doctors had revealed. She told him she was coming, but he asked her to stay with the children until he knew more. Camilla entered Charles's room alone and reached for his hand. The king kept his eyes closed. She whispered his name twice, asking whether he could hear her. After several painful seconds, he spoke only one word: William. Her fingers tightened around the bedsheet, and the silence between them became heavier than any official announcement. Then Princess Anne arrived carrying a leather folder removed from the monarch's private study before dawn. Charles had requested separate conversations with her, Camilla, and his son, suggesting he intended to settle far more than treatment arrangements. Anne held the folder against her side and told William that the documents inside concerned a decision made weeks earlier. The folder in Anne's hands would reveal that the hospital crisis had not begun with the doctor's announcement. It had begun during one private royal ceremony that Charles never completed. 3 weeks before the doctors summoned William, King Charles stood inside Windsor Castle, preparing to approve a new schedule of duties. The ceremony should have lasted less than 20 minutes. Instead, the monarch stopped halfway through the first page, lost his grip on the ceremonial pen, and remained motionless as it struck the table. Only Anne saw the fear in his face. That unfinished signature became the secret trigger behind every decision that followed, and the moment the palace could no longer dismiss. Charles had already ignored repeated warnings that exhaustion was weakening his response to treatment. He had continued meetings, receptions, and long briefings because stepping back felt like surrender. The private duty allocation ceremony, a formal meeting where the king approved who would carry out major royal responsibilities, was meant to authorise 6 weeks of overseas engagements, investitures, and constitutional meetings. Instead, it exposed how little strength he had left. The pen struck the table with a sharp sound. Charles stared at the page, then turned to Anne and asked what document lay before him. She answered slowly, watching confusion cross his face before he tried to hide it. The Princess Royal reached for the papers, but her brother pulled them back, insisting he could continue. He could not. That moment forced the palace medical team to order emergency testing, which later led directly to the devastating consultation with William. Anne refused to pretend nothing had happened. She told Charles the schedule had to be cancelled and William had to be informed immediately. The king rejected both demands. He feared his son would leave Catherine and the children behind to remain constantly at his side, turning family love into another burden the future king would carry. Charles finally broke his silence during a recorded private conversation preserved for the royal medical file. He admitted he was not most frightened of death. He feared handing William a crown wrapped in grief, unresolved disputes, and a family already divided by suspicion. Anne listened without interrupting, but she understood the truth. His silence was not protecting his son, it was preparing him for shock. Later that night, the monarch dictated a confidential instruction, transferring several duties to William and limiting who could influence decisions during any period of incapacity. An incapacity arrangement is a temporary plan used when a sovereign becomes too unwell to perform essential responsibilities. Anne's leather folder now held the unsigned schedule, the fallen ceremonial pen preserved by an aide, and the final document Charles had completed despite medical advice. Charles struggled as he signed it. Anne placed her hand beneath his wrist, but he pulled away and forced the pen forward. "This must be my decision," he said. The completed order named William as the central authority during the withdrawal. Yet one clause sharply restricted Camilla's role. When William finally read the clause governing Camilla's role, grief gave way to anger, and he walked directly toward his father's room, demanding an explanation. William did not enter his father's room as an heir seeking instructions. He entered as a son who had discovered that the man fighting for his life had made enormous decisions without trusting him with the truth. Charles was weak, but his mind remained clear. When the door closed and the aides withdrew, neither man spoke at first. Between them lay a signed order, a worsening diagnosis, and decades of emotion that royal discipline could no longer contain. William placed the document on the bed between them. The instruction gave him control over senior royal duties, palace communications, and constitutional briefings during the king's medical withdrawal. Constitutional briefings are the private updates that keep the monarch informed about government matters and national responsibilities. The order also limited Camilla to personal support and selected charity work, preventing her household from directing decisions in Charles's name. The prince asked why the truth had been hidden from him. His voice remained low, but anger sharpened every word. Charles had tried to protect the monarchy while denying his own family the chance to stand beside him honestly. William said he could have carried the fear with his father. Instead, he had been forced to discover everything from doctors and sealed papers. Charles looked down before answering. He had watched his son balance Catherine, their children, public duty, and the growing pressure of succession. The king said he could not bear to place one more burden on him before it became unavoidable. Yet his attempt at protection now felt like betrayal to both men, because silence had not reduced the pain. It had only delayed it until the moment became unbearable. William pressed the signed order flat against the bed. "Were you preparing me to become king, or preparing to leave me?" he asked. Charles turned his face away. For several seconds, the monarch could not answer. Then he revealed, through the documented medical consultation, that the doctors had warned the deterioration might become irreversible if the latest treatment failed. That warning was why he had signed the emergency instruction before William was summoned. The king also admitted why Camilla's authority had been restricted. Two competing royal households could fracture decision-making during a crisis, and William needed one clear chain of command. The Queen Consort could remain beside Charles as his wife, but she could not direct the crown while his son carried its responsibility. William pushed his chair backward, anger finally breaking through his control. Before he could speak again, Charles struggled for breath. The prince moved instantly, supporting his father's shoulders until the episode passed. For one painful moment, titles vanished. There was only a frightened son holding a weakened parent. Anne opened the door after receiving permission from the medical team. She told them senior officials were waiting to decide whether the private instruction could take effect immediately. William stepped away without offering forgiveness, while Charles closed his eyes, knowing their confrontation had settled nothing. The family's pain was now moving beyond the hospital room, because Charles's handwritten wishes were about to collide with the machinery that decides who truly holds royal power. While Charles fought a private medical battle, another struggle began around a polished conference table. Senior advisors, constitutional officials, Anne, William, and Camilla gathered to decide how the monarchy would function if the king could no longer maintain his normal duties. Yet the most powerful person in the room was not the loudest. It was William, still carrying the shock of the doctor's words and the knowledge that every signature now pulled him closer to the throne. William listened as officials began dividing the king's responsibilities. Public engagements had to be reassigned, state briefings redirected, investitures postponed or transferred, and communications with government leaders placed under one clear authority. An investiture is a formal ceremony where the monarch presents honours to selected citizens. Every change mattered, because even a temporary gap could create confusion over who was speaking for the crown. Camilla objected before the first arrangement was complete. She said no one understood Charles's intentions, fears, or emotional limits better than she did. The Queen Consort argued that removing her from strategic discussions would separate the institution from the man at its centre. Her voice remained controlled, but the hurt beneath it was impossible to hide. William answered without raising his own voice. He explained that the signed instruction did not remove Camilla from the king's side. She could remain with him, support him, and continue selected charity work. What she could not do was turn personal loyalty into constitutional authority. The prince knew the distinction sounded cold. Yet without it, competing households could issue conflicting orders during the most fragile moment of Charles's reign. Anne watched his hands tremble beneath the table. She quietly pushed a glass of water toward him and warned him not to make permanent decisions while still in shock. William took one sip, but his fingers remained unsteady. The future king was being asked to protect the monarchy while still processing the possibility that he might lose his father. Then a senior advisor revealed the most dangerous detail through the documented emergency file. Charles had prepared two versions of the arrangement. The first gave Camilla a formal consultative role, allowing her to advise William on major decisions. The final signed copy removed that provision completely. Camilla demanded to know what had changed. Anne answered that the revision had been made on the same night Charles collapsed during the Windsor ceremony. The princess said her brother had feared that divided advice would leave William trapped between duty and family pressure. An official placed the authorization page before him. William lifted the pen, but he could not bring it down. Anne leaned closer and said, "He chose you before the doctors forced him to." The prince signed once and set the pen down. The order became active immediately. Moments later, news of a cancelled royal appearance reached the press. By the time William left the meeting, the first headlines were already appearing, and Camilla was about to discover that the new order had changed her life before she had even returned to Charles's bedside. The consequences arrived with brutal speed. Charles's engagements disappeared from the calendar. William's name replaced his father's on briefing papers. Palace staff were reassigned, official calls were redirected, and entrances once controlled by the king's household now answered to the heir. Yet the most painful change occurred quietly. Camilla returned to her office and found a sealed notice stating that no instruction issued in Charles's name could proceed without William's approval. Camilla read the notice once, then again. The restriction meant that every order connected to the monarch now required the prince's authorization before palace staff could act. Around her, members of the Queen Consort's household waited for guidance, asking whether previously approved engagements and charitable decisions still remained valid. Their questions cut deeply because affection for Charles had once given her confidence within the institution. Now that same affection offered no guarantee of influence. William faced a different kind of pain. The palace had cancelled the king's public programme and announced an extended period of treatment and recovery, but the statement concealed how serious the condition had become. At the same time, the future king was told to prepare for urgent state briefings and a major national ceremony within days. A state briefing is a confidential update on government and national affairs that allows the sovereign or the royal standing in for him to remain informed. Camilla waited until her private secretary left before tearing the notice cleanly down the middle. The sound brought no relief. She immediately gathered both pieces, aligned the torn edges, and placed them back on the desk. Anger had risen quickly, but fear remained stronger. A hospital message had already informed her that Charles was asking for her, yet she delayed leaving because she believed William had hidden the final page of the instruction. Catherine received her own confidential message through the king's private office. Charles had requested that she stand beside William at every major appearance, believing her calm presence would reassure both the public and her husband. The princess understood why that mattered. William was being asked to project stability, while privately fearing that each duty might be one his father would never perform again. William entered the office prepared for him and stopped beside the desk. Staff carried the red briefing boxes from Charles's rooms into his own. Those boxes hold confidential state papers requiring royal attention, and their arrival made the transfer of responsibility impossible to deny. A framed photograph of the king remained beside the chair. The prince did not remove it. He turned it inward so his father's face would meet him whenever he sat down. Then a direct message arrived from the hospital. Charles wanted William alone. No officials, no documents, no advisors waiting near the door. The request contained no explanation, only urgency. For the first time since the diagnosis, the crown, protocol, and paperwork would be shut out, leaving only a frightened father and the son he had chosen to carry everything forward.